Good evening, everyone. My name is James Kenley. I serve as the executive director of the Vail Symposium, and on behalf of our small but mighty staff, our wonderful volunteers, Dale Mosier, our board chair, and our board of directors, thank you for being here. Thank you for spending your evening with us. Tonight's program is entitled Native Americans Now, A Path Forward with Land, Water, and Sovereignty. The Vail Symposium has been offering thought-provoking, affordable, and diverse programming to the Vail community since 1971. We are a nonprofit organization, and 90% of our operating revenue comes from donors and sponsors. And I'd like to thank a few important folks just now. Our presenting sponsors are discovervail.com, that's the town of Vail, and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. The summer season is generously underwritten by Cindy Engels, and tonight's program is part of the Conversations on Controversial Issues series moderated by Clay Jenkinson, and there's a special group that supports this series, including Alpine Bank, Nancy and Stephen Dowdle, Carol and Pete Feisman, Lainey and Merv Lappin, Jeannie and Dale Mosier, and Mary Pat and Keith Rapp. Would you please give them all a round of applause? On to tonight, I just want to share a little bit about the Conversations on Controversial Issues series. It's designed to go deeper than the headlines and provide more nuance than the news networks on complex topics. And tonight's program tackles a big one. Before I bring out our moderator this evening, I want to offer a very special thanks to Mary Pat Rapp. These programs require a lot of research and preparation, and if you don't mind, put your hands together for Mary Pat. Okay, hands up if you've seen Clay on stage. Wonderful, I don't have to read the entire bio. He is an author, and you can now find his books on the Vail Symposium shelf at the Bookworm of Edwards. He is a frequent guest in Ken Burns' documentary films, a Chautauqua-style character portrayer. He is the creator and host of the Listening to America podcast, ltamerica.org, if you're a podcast listener, and a scholar recognized at the highest level in our country with the National Humanities Medal. Importantly for the topic tonight, Clay is also the editor of the Lewis and Clark quarterly journal, We Proceeded On, and the founding scholar of the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State University. He's curated exhibitions focused on Edward Curtis, and he's in the midst of a powerful project with Native American elders that I hope he'll share about tonight. And now, without further ado, it is, as always, my distinct pleasure to welcome Clay Jenkinson.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that you're here on one of the most beautiful nights you can possibly imagine in Colorado. I'm from North Dakota, and at this time, and Tim will, whom I'll introduce here in a moment, will reinforce this, about this time in August, you go out of your door in the morning and you get the first whiff of autumn. And it's actually a marvelous moment. Because the air is crisp. It's going to be maybe 80 degrees by 3 p.m., but it's 54 or 48 when you open that door and you think, here it comes. And when we say here it comes, we mean it. Yep. We have 8 months of winter, and tough winters at that. I'm just thrilled to be here, and I have a number of things to say before I introduce our two guests. One is this Listening to America thing that I'm doing. So I'm going to be wandering the country over the next 8 or 10 years, and my dream has been to travel around in an airstream, kind of in the manner of John Steinbeck. And two of my friends who are evil tonight gave me my airstream. So, you know, There's nothing more cruel than that. So if any of you wants to replace it with the real item, I'll be here afterwards. But I'm actually going to do all of that. Thoreau said, how many a man is dedicated a new era of his life from the reading of a book. And I remember when I was 16 or 17 years old reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. How many of you have read that book? It's a great book. It's dated now, but it's changed a lot of lives. It was my first introduction to Indian country, and I've never looked back. It's one of my fascinations, and so I've been looking forward to tonight for a very long time, and particularly given these two very distinguished guests. I just want to ask you a couple of poll questions here before we begin. How many of you have ever been on an Indian reservation? Whoa.
That's a lot.
Excellent. How many of you have ever read a book on Native Americans? This is good. How many of you think that Mount Evans should be renamed? Okay, but how many of you think that this renaming business and this canceling of offensive names and logos and so on has gone too far? Okay, thank you. Don't be shy. Everyone's vote counts. How many of you think that some lands in America should be returned to the native peoples from whom they were taken? Look at this.
Land back.
Land back, huh? How many of you think that Native American young people should be given full ride scholarships to whatever university they wish to attend? A little less, but still. Interesting. So I think that really helps our guests understand. So if you would advance to the first of our two guests. Well, first of all, let me say one more thing. You probably know of Charles Wilkinson, extraordinary professor of law at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I knew him well. We've worked together. He's a pioneer in many respects. He literally wrote the textbook, the case law book on Native Americans, with the help of one of our guests here. If you go to the next, this slide, two books that I highly recommend. He died just a few weeks ago, unfortunately, and a great, great loss to the University of Colorado at Boulder and a great loss to the nation. This short book, which I recommend, it's not technical, American Indians, Time and the Law, and then a later book called Crossing the Next Meridian, Land, Water, and the Future of the West. He's riffing on Wallace Stegner's book, Beyond the 100th Meridian. And it's about how we can restore lands in the West that have been damaged by ranching, grazing, industrialization, mining, riparian damage, and so on. He was an amazing man, and so if you have time, take a look at Charles Wilkinson's books. All right, next, please. All right, here's Robert Williams, Jr., Regents Professor at the University of Arizona, the E. Thomas Sullivan Professor of Law. He's also the Director of the University of Arizona Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. We are so delighted to have you. Please welcome Rob. And Rob, just by way of short introduction, say what you did to help Charles with his case law book.
Yes, I had probably been a young law professor of about 5 or 6 years and had published a couple of articles, and one day the phone rings, and Charles Wilkinson on the line. I had learned Indian law from Charles's case book at Harvard Law School. I taught from Charles's book. I thought, maybe I had violated his copyright or something. And he says, I'm very honored to speak to you, Professor Wilkinson. Just call me Charles. How would you like to be on the case book? We need an Indian on that case book. And I said, well, I'm your Indian, happy to do it. And was just a wonderful mentor, human being, scholar. And as you said, just a huge loss. There's going to be a wonderful memorial for him at the University of Colorado. And just about every Indian law professor that Charles has mentored and advised and been a role model is going to be there. I'm absolutely certain. So.
And you were the first Native American student in your time at Harvard Law.
That's right. Yeah, when I went to Harvard Law School, I was not only the only Native American in my first year class, the only Native American out of all 3 classes, 1,500 students. So I love to tell this story. I formed the Native American Law Students Association, the first one. Named myself president, vice president,
Treasurer and all the constituents.
I was it. So.
Native American Law Review.
Yeah. Didn't get a chance. I should have. Thank you.
So welcome, please. Next slide. This is Tim Purdon looking pretty serious in this photograph. You've kind of wizened up here, lost a little hair.
Indian law is a serious business, Clay.
Yeah, it's tough work.
Tim Purdon is a dear friend of mine from Bismarck, North Dakota. Among other things, he's in private practice now, and he's the co-chair of the American Indian Law and Policy Group. But he also was the U.S. attorney, our sole U.S. attorney in North Dakota under the administration of Barack Obama. I got to know him then. We've become close friends. He is deeply involved in Native American law, and you'll get a sense of that as we go forward. Thank you for being here, Tim.
Of course. Thank you.
All right. And so now before we begin, let's go to this next slide. Here's our plan. We'll see if we can do it. We want to talk about recent Supreme Court rulings. We want to talk about land sovereignty and Native American reservations. We're going to ask who gets to tell the story of the famous incidents like the Sand Creek Massacre or the Little Bighorn or the Dawes Act, etc. We'll talk about water and natural resources. We'll talk about jurisdiction, law, and order, and it's an amazingly complex subject in Indian country. We'll talk a little bit about cultural appropriation and naming. We've already slightly addressed Mount Evans, and we'll end by talking about the future. So let's see if we can do all that. Next slide. Here it is, folks. This is what it looked like when Columbus bumbled into the continent after the Constitution was written in 1787. Georgia's not included here, but this was the land that had already been ethnically cleansed, for the most part, of Native Americans. By 1830, in the age of Jackson, you see that we've extended all the way out to the Missouri River, in some places, in the Mississippi. Lewis and Clark, after their famous expedition, were stationed in St. Louis, and they both were engaged in dispossessing the Osage and other natives of their lands. In fact, William Clark signed 1 in 10 of all of the treaties ever undertaken with Native Americans. And he was a good man in many respects. But he said after the Osage Treaty of 1807, he said, if I go to hell, it will be because of the Osage Treaty, because it was so confiscatory, even by the standards of that time. In 1890, this is the time of Wounded Knee. Remember, Wounded Knee is December 29th, 1890, here on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. This was Indian country. And now, today, you can see that just 3% of the lower 48 states are homelands and reservations for Native Americans. Next slide. I love this one because it allows me to talk just a little bit about Edward S. Curtis. Edward S. Curtis took this fabulous portrait of Red Cloud. Red Cloud was very close to death at this time. Curtis, as you know, was a white portrait photographer from Seattle. He made it his life's mission to photograph as many Native Americans as he possibly could in something like their pre-conquest state. His photographs are absolutely stunning. You've seen some of them, even if you don't remember that, including his famous Canyon de Chelly. He took 40,000 dry glass plate portraits. He recorded 10,000 cylinder recordings of Native American stories, sound, vocabularies, alphabets, and so on. He made a docudrama called In the Land of the Headhunters, and he photographed a large number of natives from 70 or almost 80 tribes in the American West, including the Ogallala leader, Red Cloud. And Red Cloud is said to have said, although it's attributed to several others, they made many promises, the white people, but they kept only one. They promised to take our land, and they did. Next slide, please. And a cartoon from the first Thanksgiving. If you feed them, they'll never leave. Next. So let's just quickly look at the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance was written by the Confederation Congress of the United States in 1787. 1787 is the year that the Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia. Meanwhile, the Confederation Congress was meeting. They passed this really extraordinary piece of legislation. The Northwest Ordinance was essentially a way of bringing in new states like Ohio and Indiana and Michigan and Wisconsin on an equal basis without colonizing our interior as the British had previously colonized America. And so this was Jefferson inspired, but to bring in new states on a firm and equal basis at the earliest possible time, as long as they maintained a Republican, that's a small r, Republican form of government. Meanwhile, the Northwest Ordinance is passed, and I want to just look at one paragraph here. And I want both of you to comment on this as your first comments tonight. Article 3, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and means of education shall forever be encouraged. The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. And in their property rights and liberty they shall never be invaded or disturbed unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them. Think of this. You can't really read this without blushing. The utmost good faith shall always be shown. Their property shall never be taken from them without their explicit consent. Their rights shall never be invaded except by just wars authorized by Congress, not by the executive or the army. And the last clause, that the government of the United States in its trust relationship with natives must intervene to protect them from being exploited by others.
Yeah.
So, Robert.
What's interesting is that phrase, the utmost good faith. Those of you who understand the law, that's a legal phrase. You know, you're supposed to have good faith in contract negotiations. And in order to implement the Northwest Ordinance, the United States had to sign treaties with the tribes to cede large amounts of their land in exchange for very small reservations. And those treaties made promises. They're very much conceptualized by the Supreme Court as a contract. In an early 1900s case called Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock, the issue came up, well, what happens if the United States breaks a treaty with the tribe? And the court said, well, the U.S. should observe the utmost good faith in honoring the treaty promises. But under separation of powers and Congress's plenary authority, we will presume good faith in whatever Congress does. And that's been the problem ever since, is the Supreme Court has never been much of a protector of Indian rights when it has to defer to congressional power.
Yeah. Sir?
And when I think about this, I think about part of my law practice where, you know, we have, Clay talked last night about the myth of the vanishing Indian, right? We have the photographs and this law, the regalia, and that's all lost. And we don't really think about Indian tribes and Native Americans, natives as existing. They have to fight to be seen and to be seen as existing. But in my practice in the last 2 or 3 years, you know, we litigate treaty claims today on a monthly basis. I'm involved in these cases. The federal government shut down the Indian Health Service hospital on the Rosebud Reservation.
South Dakota.
South Dakota. One of the CMS, Medicare, Medicaid, came in, inspected the emergency room, and said that it was such a risk to the native patients that they closed it down. One part of the federal government closed down another part's emergency room run by another part.
It was so badly operated.
Badly operated. Babies being born on the floor, people dying. You know, they shut it. It was a danger. We sued the IHS and said in the Fort Laramie Treaty, 1858, you promised the Rosebud tribe a doctor on the reservation, and you shutting down this emergency room is a violation of that treaty right. And we won. We won in the district court in Pierce, South Dakota. We won at the 8th Circuit, and we eventually convinced the Biden Justice Department, thanks to a lot of help from our friends in that administration, to not appeal that to the Supreme Court. So there is a recognized treaty right to physicians, to health care, that the courts have said you owe that to this tribe to this day. So these are live disputes. These aren't just long.
This is not just history.
No, it's alive today. And I think for most Americans who don't interact with tribes, tribal folks, you got to readjust your thinking. These are live disputes where the law often favors the tribe.
I said 1858. I should have said 1851, but 1868 is the one we're talking about here.
Yes, the second Fort Laramie
And when
Treaty.
the big pipeline controversy occurred in North Dakota a few years ago, to which we'll return, the Lakota, the Sioux, said, hey, we never gave that land to the white government of North Dakota. The pipeline, even when it's outside of the formal reservation boundaries, is still on Lakota land, and we do not authorize you to build that. So these treaties, your point is these treaties are live. They're being increasingly reorganized and refocused.
Thanks to generations of lawyers trained by people like Rob and the burgeoning tribal sovereignty movement. Tribes getting stronger. We'll talk about how tribes are getting stronger, their institutions getting stronger, and these are live disputes.
And Rob, tell us a little bit about what you've done in Arizona. When you got there, almost nothing in this way.
Yeah, so University of Arizona, land-grant university, just like University of Colorado, has an obligation to serve all of the people of the state. When I came there in '87, they'd graduated less than a half dozen Native lawyers. Since that time, we've established, in fact, my very good friend and colleague, former dean of the University of Colorado, James Anaya, who you guys stole from me and went there, but Jim and I founded the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. We've graduated over 250 lawyers Native lawyers since 1987. And that includes our program. Not only do we award the JD to Native lawyers, but we have an LLM and SJD program. Those are Masters of Laws and the equivalent PhDs. And so we're able to draw Indigenous students from all over the world. So 50 of our students are teaching Indigenous human rights in universities in Africa, in South America, in Asia. So it's just, one of those things. And what's really interesting is these students come to the U.S., these Indigenous students, because they look to the U.S. tribes and what's happening in the U.S. as an example of best practices. They want what our tribes have. So despite, as Tim said, tribes here in the U.S. are fighting for their rights, it is true that other Indigenous peoples in the world look at the U.S. model, that sovereignty model, that self-determination model, as something they aspire to.
Yeah.
And you said, I think, at breakfast that you're not only training Indigenous lawyers, but Indigenous warriors.
Legal warriors.
Legal
That's
warriors.
what the need for Native, I hate to say this, but we need more lawyers in Indian country.
That's never been said before. I'm sorry to hear you say that. But back to the Northwest Ordinance. So this was solemnly entered into in 1787, and it's been abrogated, ignored, stomped on systematically through most of American history. Robert, does it still have legal potency?
Quite frankly, no. So the Northwest was settled under there. You have those 160-acre and 80-acre plots. What's interesting is we'll talk about the Doctrine of Discovery and Johnson v. McIntosh. Johnson v. McIntosh arose out of a war that the United States fought against the tribes in the Northwest. Some of you may have heard of Tippecanoe and Tyler II. Well, the Battle of Tippecanoe was fought with the tribes of Illinois and Ohio because, quite frankly, the Indians didn't very much like the Northwest Ordinance because it really did open up that territory and set the model for settlement of the West. It was incredibly important. Thomas Jefferson had his hands in it. And so it's nothing that Indians are very, you read it, and as you said, when you look at the history, it's like, what happened?
Yeah.
You blush.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next slide here. All right, so there are three issues I want to look at before we get into the other substance of the program. One of them is the Pope. And you probably know that Pope Francis was in Canada a little more than a year ago. And next slide, please. He formally apologized to the First Canadians for the boarding schools. The boarding schools, not all bad. There's a mixed history, but on the whole, really awful. And he formally apologized to the First Canadians for this. And so there they were, and they said, well, as long as you're at it, how about rescinding the Doctrine of Discovery? And he said, let me get back to you on that one. But he went back to the Vatican, and this year he has formally, as the Pope, as the leader of more than 1 billion Catholics worldwide, rescinded the Doctrine of Discovery. So, Robert, what is the Doctrine of Discovery?
So, Christopher Columbus washes up on the shores of what he thinks is Japan and plants the standard of Isabel and Ferdinand of Castile and Aragon, which eventually becomes the Spanish crown, sails back, and before he can get back to Spain, Ferdinand has already dispatched messengers to the Pope in Rome because Under the European law of nations of the Middle Ages, the legal doctrine that was worked up by the College of Cardinals and the popes, most of the medieval popes were lawyers, they were canon lawyers. And this doctrine said that wherever a Christian prince shall discover lands occupied by heathens, infidels, and savages, as they are without grace, that Christian prince may claim those lands as long as they agree to bring those ignorant savages to the Christian faith. And it was upon that doctrine that Columbus sailed to the New World and planted that particular standard. If you read his journals, he goes through intense detail describing just how backward and savage these peoples are so that the Pope may confirm Spain's monopoly. That monopoly was incorporated into a legal doctrine called the Papal Bull Inter Caetera. And it said that any Christian prince that interfered with Spain's monopoly over these lands would be excommunicated. Well, of course, that didn't matter much to Henry VIII because he had had the Protestant Revolution. And so, as you know, the Church of England, the king is also the head of the Church of England. So he just assumed the role of the Pope, and he confirmed John Cabot's earlier discoveries of North America as belonging to any English colonists that wanted to go over there and take a charter. So the important thing is to recognize that Europe had a clear practice of authorizing through the papacy and through the English crown this idea that any lands discovered occupied by indigenous tribal peoples who weren't Christian could be claimed and then brought to possession. In 1823, Chief Justice John Marshall, in the famous case I just alluded to, Johnson v. McIntosh, has to decide whether or not the United States adopted the Doctrine of Discovery. And he says, of course, all of our rights come from Great Britain, and all of their rights to North America, and that's why Canada is included, extend from this Doctrine of Discovery, which was part of European international law. Johnson v. McIntosh is the single most cited case in all of federal Indian law. It's one of the top 10 cited cases of all Supreme Court cases because every Indian law case begins with the assumption of the Doctrine of Discovery that says because Indians are culturally and racially inferior, Europeans have superior rights to their lands. And I will tell you, you're going to get upset. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited the Doctrine of Discovery in a horrible case which deprived New York's Oneida Indians of jurisdiction over lands they had acquired and bought back that had been illegally taken.
Well, sure, when you put it like that.
So this is something called the Marshall Trilogy, and the importance of this is that Chief Justice John Marshall, 34 years, maybe one of the greatest Chief Justices in American history, had the burden of trying to decide how American constitutional jurisprudence would fit into the international doctrine of discovery. And so in three famous cases between 1823 and 1832, he laid this out and said, yes, there is a doctrine of discovery. That's why we're here. By the way, every country has a different ceremonial system for showing. So Spain does Christian religious rites on the shore, France something different. The English established their rights under the Doctrine of Discovery by building something, by building a fence, by building the fort. And when Lewis and Clark left Fort Clatsop on March 23rd, 1806, they left the fort up and they put a list of their accomplishments on the wall. And that was their way of saying, we now are claiming the Doctrine of Discovery for the Northwest. So it has been potent from that moment until this. Yeah. And you can claim that John Marshall was, this or that, but we were going to have to, weren't we? We were going to have to decide how we fit into this system.
That's right. And it's English common law, and for all of you who own property, you own fee simple. That comes from the English common law. And the Doctrine of Discovery was part of English common law, which American courts incorporated into our law.
I can't top that.
So just let me give a land acknowledgement statement before we go on. We meet tonight on lands formerly owned and occupied by the Arapaho and the Ute, and we're cognizant of that. And the Doctrine of Discovery butts up against these things, and Native peoples are increasingly, now that the doctrine has been formally rescinded, saying, now what? What are the implications? So Rob, what are the implications? Because this doesn't mean that a single acre will be deeded back.
No, at the University of Arizona, the Native faculty and students were really pushing the president to do a land acknowledgement statement. And once we got that, we said, okay, you've acknowledged the land belonged to indigenous peoples. What are you going to do about it? And it really, Land acknowledgement statements are very controversial. I know you've probably heard them and wonder why we have to go through this rigmarole. And they can be what my younger daughter calls performative, right? But unless there's some action behind it. And so what we pushed at the University of Arizona, in fact, is free tuition for all undergrad Native students who are resident in Arizona. We pushed for the appointment of a senior vice president for Native American Affairs who had the ear of the president and who was out there every day talking to tribal leaders, not only in Arizona, but throughout the Southwest. We've developed tribal micro-campuses where we're bringing the U of A out to the Pasquayaqui tribe reservation. And so again, yes, Native American people appreciate the land acknowledgement, but the key is, what are you going to do about it?
What next? What also? And Nancy Dowell was telling me last night about here, land acknowledgement statement by walking mountains here. And again, it's maybe just virtue signaling to make that statement. So what comes after it? Is it scholarships? Is it deans? And so on? Is it land returns?
Yeah, well, I have to jump in because you called it virtue signaling again. I have to make this point.
Here's this fight we have.
Because I've now, in North Dakota, only in the last year or so, started to hear land acknowledgements from our state institutions. And I didn't know that was ever going to happen. And the first time I heard one at the University of North Dakota Law School, I was incredibly happy to hear it. And I have to remind Clay that the thing about virtue signaling is when you virtue signal, you have to remember you are signaling virtue, which is better than the opposite, in my opinion. So I do think it is important. I think symbolically it is important. I think you can't give a land acknowledgement and say, there, I've made my peace with the natives in my area. I think, what is the action behind it? But it is a necessary first step. And I think it should be applauded, especially in places like Grand Forks, where this is not a topic that people are eager to talk about.
Next slide. Let's move on to the recent case, Supreme Court case, Arizona v. Navajo Nation. Rob, I think you have some pretty intimate knowledge of this case.
Yeah, I recruit a lot of Native students from the Navajo Nation, and a lot of them grew up on the nation. And the majority of them tell me the story that they or their grandmother or their auntie would travel 20 to 30 miles to get water and bring it back. If you watch Dark Winds, there was a wonderful, in episode 3, where the Navajo grandmother yells at this white guy for drinking her water out of a bucket that the horses were using, because she had to go 20 miles to get that water. So in this case, Arizona v. Navajo Nation, when the reservations were created, the Supreme Court in the early 1900s interpreted them as Congress providing a homeland for tribes. And the idea was to turn them into Jeffersonian yeoman farmers. Well, darn, you gotta have water for a homeland. And the problem, of course, is the United States has never lived up to those trust promises. It cost a lot of money to bring water from the Colorado River out to different parts of the Navajo Nation as large as Connecticut. And who's going to pay for that? And so the tribes argued in the Arizona v. Navajo Nation that, hey, the federal government made this promise for a homeland. They ought to find a way to bring that water to the reservation. And I won't steal Justice Kavanaugh's thunder.
Now let's look at what Justice Kavanaugh wrote for the majority. The Navajos do not contend that the United States has interfered with their access to water. Under the Winters Doctrine, they have considerable rights to the water that they might want to use that flows through or next to their lands. Rather, says Justice Kavanaugh, the Navajos argue that the United States must take affirmative steps to secure water for the tribe. In other words, you need to deliver it to individual hogans and so on, communities. He goes on, the historical record does not suggest that the United States agreed to undertake affirmative efforts to secure water for the Navajos, any more than the United States agreed to farm land, mine minerals, harvest timber, build roads, or construct bridges on the reservation. So the argument is, it's your homeland, you develop your infrastructure.
You figure it out.
This ignores, of course, the trust responsibility that we've talked about. That is, even though we talked about in the context of the Northwest Ordinance, it is still the law of the Supreme Court. Is that the relationship between the federal government and the tribes is a trust relationship. Like if you set up a trust for your aging mother to take care of her finances, you can't then raid that money. You have a fiduciary duty, if you're the trustee, to handle her investments because she's invalid appropriately. It's the same type of relationship. And all too often we see this attitude, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. No, the government, in exchange for that land to end the Indian wars, promised to treat the tribes as domestic dependent nations with that trust responsibility.
But, I mean, one could say that Arizona could have prevented this by simply supplying the water. Remember, under the Colorado Water Project, the United States government delivered an enormous amount of water to Scottsdale and Phoenix and so on. The countries and states do this kind of thing, but they decided not to do it for the splayed out DNA reservation.
Yeah, the Central Arizona Project was a federally funded project, and without it, you wouldn't have the cities of Scottsdale and Phoenix. Now we're running out of water already. That's the big problem in Arizona. If tribes were allocated their legal rights to water, the legal standard from the winner's case is, how much water do we get? Whatever irrigable acreage you have. Okay, and if you live in the West, I mean, if it's running 15-degree slope, we're going to irrigate that sucker. We don't care. And so, if all of that allocated water was given to the tribes, it would over-allocate the total amount of water in Arizona by 3 times. That's the problem, 3 times.
Size of Connecticut.
Yeah.
So, but it could be done, and it could be afforded. It just hasn't been done. And now the Supreme Court has said it's not our responsibility to make that happen.
Right.
You Navajo need to do that.
You figure it out
yourself. So let's go on to the next one, just so we keep moving. So this is one really for you, Tim.
Yeah.
The Indian Child Welfare Act, passed in the 1970s, said that when there is a foster situation of Native children, that they should go to natives of their family or of their clan or of their nation, or in the absence of that, to other Native Americans of other tribes, but that we should do everything in our power to make sure that Native children who need foster care go to other Native peoples.
Right, and it's important, these cases that have arisen under the ICWA case, and there are horrible stories.
ICWA is the acronym.
ICWA, the acronym, the Indian Child Welfare Act. There are horrible individual stories of children in foster care that are in, they're in a non-native foster care situation, and they're doing well, and the ICWA gets applied, and they get taken back to the reservation, placed with family, something horrible happens to them. And there are certainly examples of that. But ICWA was passed to address an even more horrible and terrible thing, which I think you've got the next slide.
So the history of colonialism of Indian children. Let's see this next slide. This is Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, who was the superintendent and director of the Carlisle Indian School. He's the father of the Indian school movement, the boarding school movement in the United States, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. If you ever get a chance to go there, the cemetery is absolutely heartbreaking. Died of broken heart at the age of 7. Died of,
the boarding school movement, which was, again, designed to do this, to kill the Indian, save the man, to cut the hair, no traditional language, take you away from your parents, and turn out, good, modern, white-style American capitalists into the country and leave behind your culture. And it was a part of a termination attitude of the United States government. We want to solve the Indian problem by doing away with tribes.
With Indianness.
With Indianness, right, all of it. And so the ICWA was passed in response to that. And what you've seen is that children that are taken away from their culture, Native children, the statistics show that they suffer from depression and suicide and things like that. The culture is an important part of it, to save the community, save the tribe, but also in the best interest of the child. And so Indian country was very, very nervous about this case, about the idea that the court might say that, well, you're
better off in a white home than you are on the reservation.
Well, I mean, the court would say that you're discriminating against people based on race. Again, tribes are not racial entities, they are political entities, but Indian country was very worried about this, because if the ICWA had gone away, you would resume those adoptive and foster care processes that move people out of their tribe. I spent some time once with the chairman of the Las Vegas Paiute, and I said to the chairman, Chairman, how many Las Vegas Paiute are there? And he said, well, it's something around like 33, 34. You start talking about a couple of kids going to foster care out of the community, the future of that tribe is put at risk. Imagine the pressure of being Las Vegas Paiute chairman, and you're thinking the number one thing you want to make sure is that when your grandkids are alive, there's still a Las Vegas Paiute tribe. That's a lot of pressure on a public servant. And the ICWA is part of that process to ensure that these tribes that have been decimated so much population-wise, that they continue to exist.
So Richard Henry Pratt directed the Carlisle Indian School, and he said this: kill the Indian, in other words, kill the Indianness in that native person, save the DNA, but kill off the culture, and that will save the human being. Yeah. This is essentially the mission statement of the boarding school movement. And as you probably know, because this has been in the news, people were sometimes kidnapped from reservations. Their parents were beaten back when they were taken. When they got to these schools, their hair was cut off. They were forced to wear uniforms. Go to the next slide. That's Carlisle. They were then, if they prayed in their native language, they were beaten. If they practiced any of their native religious rites, they were beaten.
Just a book recommendation, right? A very accessible book that touches on the boarding school history of it is a recent biography of Jim Thorp, written by Moranis, who wrote the
Clinton bio.
Yeah, the Clinton, first in his class, a definitive, fantastic Washington Post reporter, a great biographer, has written a really interesting biography of Jim Thorp, who attended and played football at the Carlisle Indian School. And it is not a book about the boarding school movement, but it's very accessible, and it tells a lot of these kids who would come from our part of the country. They have the names of these kids that were playing football with Jim Thorp, who are names that we recognize from the reservations in North Dakota, and many of them died there, never went back, and those sorts of horrible stories.
And so you've read about this, and that's why the Pope was apologizing in Canada for the papacy's, the Catholic Church's role in this. They weren't the only church. There were Episcopalians and Lutherans and others.
We just take a step back, and that the First Nations boarding schools in Canada and Carlisle and places like that, if you're running a school for children and you have a cemetery, something's not right about what you're doing.
So, moving on. This is a big one. Land sovereignty, reservations, and homelands. One of the questions I get, Rob, all the time in traveling in North Dakota and elsewhere is, isn't the reservation an outdated thing? Shouldn't we just cancel them? And a legislator in North Dakota, who's a friend of mine, said they're an example of failed socialism. So, Native Americans don't see it that way. How do they see reservations?
No, they for many tribes, they negotiated treaties within their traditional homelands, and most of those treaties might cede 90 to 95% of their traditional territory, but they held on for a reason to those original lands. And even when tribes were relocated, for many tribes, once you bury relatives, once you do ceremonies on that land, that cultural connection is just as strong. Your family is there, your clan is there, your history is there, your language. For many tribes, we talk about language revitalization. We've done a lot of work with tribes, both in Canada and the United States. Language is basically the way that you remember where you go and gather, where you wait, to hunt, where you go for ceremony, where your elders are buried. So that relationship between land, culture, and identity can't be broken. And that's why I think tribes hold on so tenaciously. And not only that, they want more of that traditional land, because quite frankly, if you talk to a lot of tribes, they'll tell you, you guys keep messing it up. You got to get it back to us to help you understand how to take care of this land we've been on for 10,000 years.
It may not be the best land in Nevada or Arizona, but it's the homeland, and it's where you go when you're in trouble. It's where you go when you want to be surrounded by people of your own stamp. It's where you go to see your elders' graves and so on. So, Tim, talk a little bit about what's known as the land back concept.
So, first of all, recommendations. New movie coming out, going to be streamed on Hulu this fall. I saw it last week, 2 weeks in Bismarck, Lakota Nation versus the United States. And this is the story of the 80-year legal case when the Lakota Nation in South Dakota sued the federal government because the federal government broke the treaty and took the Black Hills. And the Lakota eventually won that case, and the federal government was ordered to pay them, at the time, $350 million for taking this property. That money now still sits in an account in Washington, D.C.
They refused to take it.
It's now worth over $1 billion. The Lakotas don't want it. They want the Black Hills back. And this movie explains that history in a very, very well done, can't recommend it enough, this fall on Hulu. And so from that springs, from the Lakota, but more broadly than that, springs this land back movement, which is in the post-DAPL protest, Dakota Access Pipeline, the large protest south of Bismarck where we live, that riveted the nation.
2016, 2017.
Yeah, riveted the nation on the environmentalist and the tribal movement there. There has been this call to land back. In the Lakota Nation movie, my friend Mary Catherine Nagel says, natives say land back, and whites, their eyes all light up and say, you don't mean all of it, right? I mean, so there is the idea, you hear land back, it can be off-putting. But the federal government controls so much land in the West, and that land could be co-managed or returned, or there is lots of land that the best stewards are not necessarily some federal bureaucrat, but the descendants of the tribes that have lived, as Rob said, on that land for 10,000 years. So you look at co-management, you look at some of the things the Biden administration's done with Bears Ears and the recent things in Grand Canyon to restore, protect land, and then bring tribal leaders in, tribes in to help co-manage that. And tribes have always been capable of that. Their institutions have gotten so much stronger in their current forms over the last 50 years. And you have some great comments about what the statistics show when tribes are involved in conservation.
Yeah, the famous story, of course, is the Pacific Northwest salmon cases, and when the tribes brought those cases. And the deciding factor was the ability of the lawyers, in fact, Charles Wilkinson worked on those cases, by the way, was the ability of the lawyers to show statistics from the Washington Fish and Game Department, which said that indigenous managed fisheries were much more better managed than state managed fisheries. And the judge, a guy named William Bolt, who had been a sport fisherman, really hooked onto that, and that became one of the major issues. And it's become an important litigation as well as negotiation and regulatory strategy for tribes to try and get back that regulatory power, because land back doesn't only mean getting the title back, but getting the power to manage that land and steward that land according to traditions and culture. You may have heard, I was just up in Canada, you may have heard of all the forest fires up there. And most of that land being burned is traditional and reserved land of First Nations. And they have been begging BC and Alberta forest regulators to let them do their traditional burns. And because we've never seen it, we know how to do this. They gave them a 600-acre plot and showed that the game and wildlife, moose, badgers, 3 to 4 times more were coming on that 600 acres than the lands that were being managed by the timber companies in the state. We know that First Nations do it better because their lives, their sustenance, their culture depends on responsible stewardship of those lands. And so the land back movement is much more than just getting title back. It's getting that ability to exercise that native knowledge, that native scientific knowledge of how to manage these and show the rest of this country the ways toward conservation, these great challenges that we have for climate change.
Just a couple of things here. First, the Black Hills. So I was at the University of Minnesota when that case was adjudicated in Minneapolis. And it was front page headline news for months. And the Lakota under the 1868, the Sioux under the 1868 Great Sioux Treaty claimed that they had never given the Black Hills to the white government, which is true, because under the provisions of the 1868 treaty, the white government could never take another acre of Lakota land without 3/4 signatures of all the adult males of the tribe. Well, think of trying to get 3/4 signatures of anybody anywhere. And so they never did it. And after George Custer discovered gold in 1874, we just went in and took it. And so their view is, hey, you have broken the treaty. That treaty has the status of constitutional and an international law. You could give us $1 billion, you could give us $20 billion. We don't want the money because money goes through your fingers. We want the land. And as Tim said, in the Black Hills, more than 2/3 is federally owned. Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, National Park, National Forest, etc. So this could be land backed without goring anybody's ox, but we'll see, right?
We'll see, yeah.
But I want to say too of this. I know there are people in this audience who are sort of internally rolling their eyes at a little of this.
Sure.
Because we're presenting a kind of very native advocacy point of view up here. And I think some people think, and I want you to address this, they think, look, conquest is eternal. The Romans, the Greeks, Alexander the Great, the Anglos, the Saxons, this is the nature of things, folks. It's sort of what Ronald Reagan has said to us, we took the Panama Canal fair and square, we stole it. Some people feel, look, this is what happened. We have to accept this, this is what cultures do. So get over it already, make the best of the world that you have, but we're under no particular obligation to be bending over backwards to help you out. You know this is true, we hear this every single day in our lives, right? So Rob, first you.
I deal with this issue all the time, and I think it's important to understand that when I teach human rights, and one of the first things that you teach about human rights is The human rights system arose after World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust. Most of you may know, it was Eleanor Roosevelt who drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights based on the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. And when indigenous peoples turn to the United Nations, when they cite their human rights, the Holocaust taught us that all cultures are valuable. And so the purpose of the human rights system is to preserve and to guarantee, the state has an obligation to preserve and guarantee the cultural integrity, the cultural identity, and cultural survival of every group. You just can't use any excuse. And quite frankly, conquest is no longer an excuse under international human rights law for denying people under your subjugation equal rights, the same rights as your other citizens. And so land back, why do you want the land back? Because without the land, indigenous people's cultural survival, integrity, and identity have no way of surviving because they are land-based cultures. And that's what makes Indians different from every other minority group. Their cultural survival, their cultural identity depends on their relationship to their lands.
And I will say this because Clay and I both live in North Dakota, and
I speak for the attitude of most white
yeah,
North
and
Dakotans.
when I think about this, can't they just get over it?
Yeah,
attitude.
get over it already.
I get exercise, so now I'm standing up.
Right.
I think that if the attitude is, well, we got to get over this and move forward, to have that attitude and espouse that attitude and say, well, this was all in 1878 or Custer and he's been long gone.
Got what he deserved.
I think the first thing we have to do is stop doing terrible things to tribes. I live in Bismarck. 30 miles north of Bismarck is a dam on the Missouri River, the Garrison Dam, which was a flood control project of the Pick-Sloan era to stop the flooding, protect the farmers.
1950s.
1950s. And the land that was submerged behind the reservoir was almost exclusively, some very, very high percentage, Native American land of the reservation that had been given to the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara.
It had been retained for them.
It had been retained for them. That was part of their reservation. Right. And their the best of their lands were the cottonwood, riverbed, farmland, beautiful. That was the heart of their community.
They were farmer natives, and the 155 best acres were in the river bottoms, and they were largely self-sufficient when the dam came in, and they weren't consulted by the Corps of Engineers.
And Elbowwoods and Nishu are the names of villages that were flooded, that
9 villages were
still
flooded
exist. Out. You can go out on your boat on Lake Sakakawea, we named the lake after a native, and you can see the homes at times that have been flooded.
95% of all the people were relocated up onto the bluffs.
I talk to people in North Dakota, I say, you know how there's a town on the reservation called Newtown? Do you know why it's called Newtown that was founded in the 50s and 60s? Because the other towns were flooded and they had to make a new town.
Without consultation.
Without consultation. And when you go to the MHA Nation and you sit in their tribal government, the chambers, they have the famous photograph of the chairman at the time, George Gillette, who's a relative of friends of ours. And Chairman Gillette is weeping in his hands as they sign the Pick-Sloan project.
In Washington, D.C. There's a signing ceremony, and he's openly weeping because he said, I think this is the end of our tribe.
I think this is the end of my people. So when you say just get over it.
It wasn't just back then.
No, when I was U.S. Attorney and I saw that picture and I talked to people who can recall getting in the station wagon and leaving as the floodwaters of Lake Sakakawea put their town underwater. This is not ancient history. So to me, when I hear get over it, I think, it's not ancient history. There's still people walking today who remember losing their homes. And why was the Garrison Dam created? Flood control, power, electricity,
navigation,
right? Energy, recreation for sport fishermen, things like that. The tribes have given a lot. They've given a lot for the benefit of this country. And to say get over it or give a little more rings hollow with me.
Yeah. All right, so I just want to reiterate that not everybody agrees with this.
Sure.
And we must be cognizant of the various perspectives. And there are well-meaning people who hold views very different from your views.
There's no question. And some of my frustration comes from the idea that most Americans, really when they think of Indian tribes and Native Americans and natives, they don't really have any frame of reference. Maybe they grew up where there was a casino You know, they don't grow, and that's their association. They're not aware that there are vibrant, thriving cultures that exist and are part of our country, the fabric of our country, and centers of energy in dying rural America. And so that is, to me, the frustration is just sort of the lack of knowledge.
I just want to say two more things about this. If you're interested in this story, there's a fine book by Paul Vandervelde called Coyote Warrior about this very situation. It's one of the most depressing stories of 20th century exploitation of native peoples. 385 families were moved up onto the windswept bluffs from the bottomlands. In some sense, the tribes have never fully recovered, although the Bakken oil has made certain difference. And now there is a magnificent Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara interpretive center at Newtown. And I don't know if you've seen it yet, but one wall sort of recapitulates the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington. It has the name of every family that was flooded out and forcefully removed up onto the bluffs. No commentary, just those names. And when you see it, whatever your views of this, maybe the dam was an important thing, but whatever your views, your heart is broken for those families. So it's a very, very important story. We would have talked more about it, but we want to keep
It seems like we did talk more about it.
You started it. You got up out of your chair.
I'll probably get up again. We'll see what comes up later.
So let's just skip the next one, please, and go to the second slide. Next again. All right, so I just wanted to spend a minute on this. So look at this, everybody. This is the South Dakota, and you see what looks like a lot of Indian land, right? Mostly Lakota, partly Dakota here and here, but it's Sioux. It's the Sioux Nation. And it was broken up after the Battle of the Little Bighorn into these disparate little scattered places because the Black Hills are here, and that's what the white government wanted because of the gold, and $400 billion worth of gold have been pulled out of those mines in South Dakota, and the Lakota want that back too. But you think of this and you think, well, that's quite a lot of Indian land, isn't it? Oh no, next slide. That's, back one more, go back please. You see this right here? That's the Cheyenne River Sioux Indian Reservation. Now look at it in this next slide. All right, so the gray is tribal trust land. That is, the Lakota own that land in trust. No single individual owns it, the tribe owns it. Then there's tribal allotment land. Under the Dawes Act of 1887, Native peoples were heavily encouraged and sometimes pressured to file homestead on their own reservations, 80 acres, 160 acres. And once they did, once all the people had had a chance to enroll for this Homestead Act under the Dawes Act, the rest of the lands that were on the reservation were now defined as surplus so that white people could come and homestead there. So all the white pieces here are owned by non-Indians, and yet this is the reservation. And under the Dawes Act, fully 50% of this one was alienated to non-Indians. And across the country, 40 to 60% of all reservations, with one or two exceptions, were alienated under the Dawes Act. So say a little bit about that.
Well, I know you have this thing about Teddy Roosevelt, Clay. But Teddy Roosevelt, in his first presidential inaugural address, praised the Allotment Act. He called it a mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. And you can see him charging up San Juan Hill saying that, right? But it was genocidal in its intent. It meets the definition of genocide. It was purposely intended to destroy the culture. Clans, BIA agents recognized that the clan system was the governance system. So the allotments were spread out and families were separated out onto different areas of the reservation. Courts of federal offenses were established whereby traditional Indian religious and cultural practices were criminalized, with the BIA sitting there watching the tribal judge, making sure he interpreted the code of Indian offenses. The residential school system was part of this idea of civilizing the Indian. So that's my comment.
All right, and don't make me get up and defend Roosevelt, because there's more to Roosevelt than meets the eye.
Okay,
I wrote an exhibit about him recently, and one panel is on Roosevelt and Native Americans, and the first line is, "It's not as bad as it looks." but if you have to start with that line, you know you're in trouble.
Right.
So just think of it. The next time you see a map of Indian country in America, realize that only a fraction of it is actually occupied and owned
by the
either
tribe.
in tribal trust or by individual Native Americans. And that doesn't count fractionalization.
And let's be very precise. individual Native Americans that have been allotted this land, they don't own the land. They don't hold title. The Department of Interior
In trust.
owns the land in trust for them. That's right. Go try and get a bank loan on some land you don't own that the Department of Interior owns in trust for you. That's another part of the inability to attract capital to the reservation. So it's not, it's a big difference if you have a fee title to your land.
And yet the title to those white sections is in fee simple.
Yeah, Department of Interior doesn't stand between you and the bank. there.
Next slide, please. We are only touching on these. Next slide, please. So, and look at this. This is what happened. So here, look at this. So here's Red Cloud. Remember him? White people make promises. They used his image without permission, of course, to talk about get a home for your four easy payments. It's like a late night ad on television. Perfect title, possession within 30 days, and then Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, and so on. So it's a sad, sad story of dispossession.
Yeah, and the leverage that the federal government got, they would pay the Indians about 1/4 of the eventual 8 per acres that they would then charge white settlers.
Yeah.
And the idea was that if you surrounded Indians with white farmers, they'd pick up the white man's corn road.
So we have this, I hope we're doing a good job of explaining what's called the termination era, where the federal government was trying to solve the Indian problem by simply not having reservations, not having tribes, not having these cultures. We're going to use all of these levers. We're going to take away their kids and send them to boarding school and cut their hair and kill their language. And we're going to give away their land to white people. It is a sad period of time in American history.
The reservations were begun as temporary holding camps for Native peoples to be eliminated once they were fully assimilated. And the official policy of the United States from around 1890 to 1934 was assimilate them fully into white culture until they are invisible as Native people. They can have some, Indian rights and so on, just as the Irish have St. Patrick's Day, but they will be indistinguishable from their white brethren. And all these were deliberate policies, including here in our beloved state of Colorado. How many Indian reservations in Colorado? 1 in the extreme southwestern corner, just a piece of the Ute reservation. So we need to keep moving, but you get the point. All right, who tells the story? So next slide. I'm fascinated by this. How many of you have seen the new Sand Creek exhibit in Denver? I just urge you to go see it. So here's what happened. The Colorado History Center decided in 2013 to make an exhibit on the Sand Creek Massacre, which occurred in November of 1864. They did it with considerable attempt to be inclusive and sensitive. The Arapaho and the Cheyenne, who were the victims of this massacre, said, wait a minute, that doesn't tell the whole story. We reject that you did this without, you consulted us, but you didn't include us as stakeholders. So the Colorado History Center said, fair enough, and they pulled it and put that exhibit in a warehouse, and they asked the Arapaho and the Cheyenne to write their own exhibit, and they did. And you must go see it if you have time. So next slide. There's Sand Creek. It's essentially western Kansas, and you really, really have to want to go there because it is, eastern Colorado. I love it out there. Pumpkin Center, have you ever been to Pumpkin Center? One of the most remote places in North America. That's where it occurred. And there's not much there, although it's a National Historic Site. Next slide. And here is the Arapaho and Cheyenne interpretation. There are about 30 such panels. Several. We tried to make peace again and again. We went to see the governor. We petitioned Congress. We were at peace. We were under a white flag of surrender, and an agreement had been made with Governor Evans that we would be protected as long as we flew that white flag, etc. The next one. You see that this is not your grandparents' exhibit. It's unrelenting, but true. And so my question to both of you, starting with Robert, is who gets to tell the story? Because, we have all grown up with Custer and Wounded Knee and, the Trail of Tears. Who gets to tell the story?
Storytelling is integral to Native culture. Every Native student I have will tell me about the stories their aunties and their grandparents and their parents told them. And we have this silencing of voices. One of the things that happens at universities is that the percentage of Native students is so small that they're invisible. And this invisibility has been really the plague I think many of you hopefully have learned something tonight that you didn't know. Again, that history is so profoundly disturbing that it's not easy to retell. We have an absolutely horrible movement in this country. I was taught by Professor Derek Bell, who is regarded as the founder of critical race theory. I was on the LLM committee for Kimberly Crenshaw, who invented this idea of intersectionality. And those voices in Arizona, I don't know about Colorado, but in other neighboring states, there are over 20 states now that have legislation that forbid the teaching of essentially critical race theory, even though the legislators who voted for it have no idea what it is, they just don't like it. And so the desire to tell these stories has always been there. The opportunity, as you said, it's late 2013. What were they thinking? Without consulting. That doesn't happen anymore. And even advertisers, I get calls quite a bit from marketing companies who want, can you take a look at this ad and tell me if it's racist or not? What will you pay me for my opinion? But there is a lot more sensitivity and a recognition of the need for that Indian voice. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing those types of voices being suppressed. We don't want our children to hear the horrible things. And how many people think your children should have learned some of this in school?
Yeah, right.
But, I want to again recenter the conversation, and I'm not wanting to sound like the village conservative here, but honest people can feel that some of this has gone too far, that it's come too fast, that we need time to assimilate these new views, that when these things happen really quickly and there's a new orthodoxy and many honest people are not up to speed on it, they feel shamed. You know this, that it's important to bring people along, and to assume that every enlightened person gets what you get or what you get is, I think, simply wrong-headed, and it's led to an enormous national backlash, as you know.
Yeah. I just want to say, in terms of who tells the stories, that one of the things that we're lucky about, and again, I trace this again to the protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline, 2016, 2017, near Bismarck. We're going to build a pipeline across the Missouri River just to the north of the Standing Rock Reservation. And in that protest that led indigenous people to come together in a way they hadn't since literally, I'm going to tell the story.
More than 100 years.
Since the Battle of,
keep it brief.
Yeah, Battle of Greasy Grass, Little Bighorn. So I represented one of the tribal leaders who'd been sued by the pipeline company, got an injunction against him, couldn't protest anymore.
Go to 36, please.
And I went to down to see him and at Standing Rock, and I walked in, and there standing in the tribal headquarters was the president of the Seneca Nation from New York, which is a long way from Standing Rock, North Dakota. I said, "Oh, President John, what are you doing here?" "I'm here for the protest to protect the water and this." And I met with my client. I walked out, and here came a flatbed truck with a totem, many tens of feet tall,
a traditional
Northwestern totem pole, and out jumped the driver. Said, "Oh my gosh, this is beautiful. Who are you? Where are you from?" "Oh, I'm from the Yakama Nation in Washington, and we're here to support the Standing Rock tribe." And from that coming together of tribes, I went back and said, they're going to arrest 20 natives, there's going to be 200 here the next day, they're going to arrest them, and there's going to be 20,000. And I was right. But from that, I consider myself Gen X, right? So the millennials.
Really,
yeah,
Gen X?
Yeah, I am. I'm not a boomer.
You're at the upper end.
I'm not a boomer.
The beard doesn't cover it all up.
The millennials and the older Gen Z native leaders that understand social media, they ran the social media and the messaging of this event, and it captured the nation and the world. And those leaders have learned those lessons, and they've gone back to their home tribes. And that generation of native leaders, who's going to tell the story? They're going to tell their story. And it's going to be a really good thing for this country.
Can I tell a quick story?
And then I will tell a story too.
And again, so I think 6 of my students were up at Standing Rock. One of my students, Michelle Cook, helped organize the Water Protectors Legal Collective. And you had thousands of people from all over the world.
Thousands.
Thousands. And they had to organize, how are we going to feed these? We've got sanitation issues. And what happens is they brought in the elders and they sat in circles and they said, tell us the stories of how you took care of yourselves, of your people when you came into camp. And those were the principles that they organized those camps by. And they survived in some really, really tough environmental conditions. And it was because, as one of my students, it was the stories we heard that gave us the strength that we could do it.
Water is life, so let me tell a story.
Yeah.
Tim, you'll recognize this. So my mother was 82, And my daughter was a recent graduate of Columbia University, so talk about critical race theory. And so she was home for Christmas, and my mother was with me. We were in Bismarck, and my daughter said, "Grandma, we should go down there. We should go down there to take a look. We should drive down there." My mother said, "Absolutely not. We are not going down there." She said, Leo DiCaprio's down there, a bunch of Hollywood actors. It's all been invaded by celebrities, and it's been distorted. It may have had virtue in the beginning, but now it's all been ruined. And Catherine said, "Get in the car." And my mother so loved her that she got in the car. We drove down there. We bought some tobacco, we bought some coffee, we went down. It was a village of, at that time, 8,000 or 10,000 people, zoning, sewage control, food delivery, etc. Amazing spiritual rites of different tribes. And at the end of the day, when we drove back, my mother said, "Thank you. You opened my eyes. I can't ever think about this in quite the same way again." And you know that, Claudia, these young people forced Gen Xers to go see this.
Yeah. Claudia's my daughter, and she just finished her freshman year of college as well. And
Vanderbilt.
At Vanderbilt. And this going to the camp numerous times, bringing water, I mean, the experience for her, and again, she's not native, right? Imagine the native youth coming by the busloads from all over the country. So the movement, the land back movie that I talked about, Lakota Nation versus United States, native financed, native executive produced, it is the young leaders in Indian country that are going to tell their story.
The concern was that the pipeline, as pipelines do, could rupture 1 mile north of the reservation. Their water supply came from the Missouri River, and millions of people downstream, 19 million, might be affected by it, et cetera, et cetera. Let's go to 38. Look at this statistic. Next one. Yeah, 49% of all tribal homes in this country do not have access to reliable water sources, clean drinking water or basic sanitation. And Rob, you see this every day.
Yeah. Yes.
I was recently on the Diné, the Navajo reservation, and you have these Hogans who are, you see them, and there's like one small little ranchette in an immensity of land, of sagebrush country on these plateaus. So 30 miles from town, maybe more. Some students on these reservations spending 4 hours in a bus to go to a school.
Yep.
And yet there is not a toilet in the house, there is not running water in the house.
And to get into the 21st century, when COVID came, the U of A said, "Oh, we'll just shut down classes and we can deliver everything by computer." And then the native students say, "Well, we have to drive 25 miles to sit in the parking lot of Starbucks to download our homework."
Law and order.
Statistics for 49% is nothing. And the tribes, Dakota, Oldham, 80% of the people do not have access to internet. Imagine what your life would be like if you did not have access to internet. And this is just one of the chronic conditions in Indian country.
I think we should talk about what your life would be like if you didn't live in a community that had adequate public safety.
That's where we're going next, and I want you to be exceedingly
I'm going to go.
concise.
I'm going to be tight on it. We're going to get through it.
So let's go to 42. That's 43, but that'll be all right.
That'll be perfect.
42 is fine. So this is a diagram of what?
So I served as 5 years as the United States Attorney for the District of North Dakota. That's a federal prosecutor prosecuting federal crimes. You commit a crime here in Colorado, you're going to be prosecuted by the local district attorney, the county attorney. Indian country reservations in North Dakota and other parts of the country are different. The determination of what cop has the jurisdiction to investigate, what prosecutor has the right to indict, and what judge hears the case turns on the tribal affiliation or non-tribal affiliation of the victim and the perpetrator. And there's this incredible matrix, all this complexity that is laid on top of the criminal justice system because of a case called Oliphant versus Squamish, which was decided in the 70s, which said that tribal courts do not have jurisdiction over non-natives who commit crimes on their reservation.
So Tim, let's say I go onto the reservation and I rob somebody and beat him severely with a hammer. I'm a white person on the Mandan reservation. What happens?
Well, the tribal court can't charge you. If the victim was a white person, then Mercer County might have, or McLean County might have jurisdiction.
So the white county.
The white county.
Right.
If the victim was a native, then the federal court, the U.S. Attorney's Office, would have jurisdiction. When I was U.S. Attorney in Newtown, North Dakota, there was a home invasion and a quadruple homicide. Somebody breaks into a home, shoots 4 people, a young child hid under one of the bodies and survived, not old enough to talk.
The perp was a white person?
When the police showed up, the perpetrator had left. The victims were non-native, non-Indians, non-enrolled members, white people. We didn't know if the shooter was a white person, a non-native, or an enrolled member. If the shooter had been a white person, murdered white people, the county and the state police and the county sheriff would have had jurisdiction. If the shooter was native, the FBI and my office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, would have had jurisdiction. Can you imagine a quadruple homicide in your community where the cops get there and they look at each other because it's a whodunit, and they say, well, geez, I don't know who's supposed to investigate this crime. Let's sort this out before we go try and find the bad guy. If that was the situation in your community, there would be riots in the street until the law was changed to fix it. No one would live with that level of complexity because it really, really impacts and reduces the ability to bring public safety to your community. We eventually found the shooter. He was native. He committed suicide when the police were trying to arrest him.
In this case, native kills whites.
Yes, so
on the reservation.
On the reservation. So the U.S. Attorney's Office, spoiler alert, we learn at the end. But these sorts of discussions about who has jurisdiction, they're occurring in the middle of the night on the side of the road with a tribal cop and two, white people with meth and AK-47 or AR-15s in their truck, and we're trying to decide what cop has the right to protect the community. It's time to fix this. The Congress can fix this. They need to repeal the Oliphant case. Joe Biden, in his platform for Indian country during the election, advocated for an Oliphant fix. If you give tribal courts jurisdiction over the crimes in their community, a lot of this complexity goes away. I flew here from North Dakota. I don't expect if I commit a crime here that the Eagle County Sheriff can't arrest me because I happen to be from North Dakota. I've subjected myself to the jurisdiction of law enforcement by being here. Why can't that be the same on the reservations? It should be. It's really important to fixing this problem of public safety on the reservation.
So let's say I do a terrible thing. I'm a white person. I do a terrible thing. Two natives on the reservation. The tribal police come and say, "You can't touch me."
You got it.
Depending.
The law has been shaded, and they have the right to briefly detain while they call a federal officer, a BIA officer, something like that. So but there was an issue on this exact case. Just went to the Supreme Court a year ago. These are live issues and disputes being. The Williams Indian law casebook being debated between a county deputy and a tribal cop at 3 in the morning on the side of the road. That is, as they say in Washington, that's a suboptimal outcome.
So we got to move on, but you've given a lot of your life to this very question.
It's something that I learned about when I was a part-time public defender representing natives on the reservation. I said, this is wrong. We've got to do a better job. I wonder if I could be U.S. Attorney someday and do something about this, and I was lucky enough to have that happen.
So for many of the people who are here, and I mean no disrespect, some of these are things that you haven't had a chance to know or think about, that this is new information to lots of people. Let's look at one that we all know about. 43, cultural appropriation. 44, this great cartoon. But I'm honoring you, dude. We know that in North Dakota because we've had the Fighting Sioux issue that lasted for 20 years, and the white supporters of the UND school, the UND Fighting Sioux, said, no, this is honoring the Lakota. This is our way of showing respect. Next slide. But look at this. Look at this beautiful picture of this young dancer. It's magnificent. Next. Look at the pride here, right? This is what's going on in Indian country. It's not all good news, but it's certainly not all bad news.
No, not at all.
But now look what cultural appropriation looks like. Think of this. This happens all the time.
Every day.
Next. Look at this. So here you have, I guess the Cleveland Indians are no longer called that, and that logo has been retired just in the last 2 years. But the issue is, what if we had the Cleveland Asians? What if we had the Cleveland Africans? What if we had the Cleveland Hispanics? And you immediately say, of course. But we learned to live with those caricatures, didn't we?
I recently wrote a letter on behalf of a North Dakota tribe to a high school in Iowa that had the Spirit Lake Indians, and the school board said, well, we were given permission by the Spirit Lake tribe in North Dakota to use this a long time ago. Nobody at Spirit Lake had ever heard anything about that. So these issues continue, and it when you dehumanize folks, it leads to this idea that Indians don't exist anymore, that they're not part of our a nation, and that leads to a misunderstanding that, oh, that's all well in the past, and it ignores the vibrant communities and the power and the need to have them at the table for conservation, and that's I think that's what's the problem with these sorts of things.
Yeah, the cognitive psychology literature shows that children learn their stereotypes, whether they're negative or positive, by 3 to 5 years old, and they become hardwired in the brain. You can't undo it. And a very famous Stanford psychologist did a study. She was sitting in a park in Berkeley, very multicultural, right? She wanted to see how little kids from different races interacted with each other. And she tells this story that she personally observed. A little white girl with her mommy, about 3 years old, sees a black woman pushing a baby carriage. And she said, "Mommy, Mommy, take me over there. I want to look into the baby carriage." And she looks into the baby carriage pushed by the black mother, and she says, "Look, Mom, a baby maid." 3 years old. Do you understand the harm these stereotypes do? They become imprinted on our mind. And you're absolutely right. This idea that there's nothing dynamic going on. Why do you stay on the reservation? Why don't you get over it? And it's these stereotypes that contribute to that mentality is, why would you want to be Indian?
Yeah, I represent the families of 2 young Native basketball players in North Dakota who, while playing in a high school league sanctioned basketball game, were taunted from the stands by the opposing team's fans with war whoops and racial epithets in 2023.
Including the phrase Prairie N. Prairie N.
So this resulted in, we filed a complaint with the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, and we have convinced the North Dakota, or we're in the process of trying to convince the North Dakota High School League to have a zero tolerance policy for these Native kids as they go in what should be, again, if we're not protecting our high school athletes from this sort of thing, we've got a ways to go. So this is, I mean, again, there's a lot of hope, though. I mean, there's been a lot of bad news here in the last 15 minutes.
Next slide. Yeah. So we got 4 minutes here before we turn to you
for
your questions, because that'll give us plenty of time to talk about these things. So where are we headed? Next slide. The Honorable Deb Haaland, the first Native American Secretary of the Interior of the United States. Not only does that symbolize a change of views in the country, but it gives an example to countless numbers of Native people, hope in every sort of direction. She's changing the world quietly. Talk a little bit about that.
And beyond symbolism, every single issue that's brought before the Department of Interior now, which is not just the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
BIA,
right, and not just
BLM.
Those, it's the National Park Service, Public Lands, BLM, all have a Native point of view at the table, and it's going to profoundly change the Department of Interior, in my opinion.
Yeah, at the University of Arizona, we have a program that we work with called Native Nations Institute. And what we do is teach what we call nation building. Okay, 60s and 70s were great. You had treaty rights recognized. You had your reservations, had their territory stabilized. You got more jurisdiction. Now you got to manage it. And that's the big challenge for the 21st century, indigenous governance. How do tribes bring the native knowledge, the traditions, the culture from their way of living and make it meet the challenges of the 21st century? And what you're seeing is tribes asserting jurisdiction, tribes asserting the ability to co-manage, to do it better, tribes demanding the right to safety on the reservation. Let me just say this, hooking this up, with this issue of law and order. It is what we're going to see in the future. I think what you're going to see is tribes really focusing on controlling the reservation. There's a wonderful tradition in Western philosophy by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Why do we have governments? Why do we need governments? What's the number one responsibility of government? It's to protect your personal integrity, to protect you from violence. If the government can't do you that, if Genghis Khan is coming over and can't defend you, what good is it? And so think about it. That's your most fundamental human right. It's the obligation of your government, and Indian people can't look to their governments and demand that right. And that's where you're going to see a lot of action, a lot of legal challenges, and a lot of activity by tribes.
I mean, we see, I started practicing law in North Dakota in the mid-90s. And so, we talked about the termination era, but in the 70s, the termination era, in the 70s became the self-determination era. The federal government shifted, and Richard Nixon was part of this. We're going to give tribes the opportunity to self-determine their future, and we're going to protect their sovereignty, we're going to do these things. So a lot of tribal governments in the 70s began that process. That's only 50 years ago. And so when I started practicing in the 90s, 30 years ago, tribal institutions, tribal court systems, tribal prosecutors, tribal police, they were only 20 years old sort of in that form. Tribal governments in that form, only 20 years old. And there were problems. 30 years later, 50 years under their belt, they're so much stronger. They're so much better. There are tribal court systems now that are in some instances better funded and better handled, better lawyers than there are in county court systems some places in this country. And so every day, as those governments age, every day tribal governments get stronger. Every day our tribal, our friends and our native friends get stronger, and they start to export their sovereignty. Well, the DAPL pipeline didn't go through the reservation, it's right north of it, but we're still going to have a say. We're going to have a say in what happens off the reservation that impacts us. That's a projection of sovereignty. And you're going to see more and more of that because, especially in the West, there are a lot of reservations, there are a lot of tribes, and consultation is going to move from not we're telling you what to do. Consultation is going to eventually, I think, hopefully come to consensus or that sort of an exercise of sovereignty.
Let me make one more comment about the future. You are going to be buying your Teslas on the reservation, okay? So many states have a statute which say that car manufacturers, GM, Ford, can't directly market to individuals. You have to go through franchises. And Elon Musk discovered tribal sovereignty. I think it's a wonderful thing to have the richest man in the world in favor of tribal sovereignty because he just signed a deal with the Pequot Reservation, which is not subject to Connecticut's franchise law, and he can sell his cars directly to you from the reservation. Avoid some taxes and other regulatory as well.
Sovereignty can be very good for business, and you're going to have these centers of entrepreneurship and energy where in rural America, where the young people don't leave and not come back. Tribal youth that go off to schools like Columbia and Vanderbilt come home.
Yeah, they come back.
Because that's their home. And you're going to see the tribal reservations in the West become centers of entrepreneurship, talent, energy, and rural America, folks, in North Dakota, places, rural eastern Colorado, those parts of the country, they need centers of excellence, innovation, entrepreneurship. They need those if rural America is going to survive.
Just a couple of things here. First of all, I want to thank Mary Pat again for all the work that she did to help prepare. Thank you, Mary Pat. And when you look at this photograph, I don't know what you see, but I see pride and formidability. And what an amazing photograph this is. Next slide quickly. Next slide. Nursing, doctors, MBAs,
People coming back.
lawyers, you name it, the professional classes, and you're graduating how many per year?
Out of a class of 140, we graduate 12 native JDs and another 10 with indigenous students with LLMs and SJDs.
And some of them are now teaching others around the country.
Yeah, exactly. 20 of my students are teaching Indian law in universities throughout the United States.
Next one. This is Obama, and I just want to quickly tell the story. I know we're out of time, but President Obama came to the Standing Rock Reservation after the pipeline crisis.
No, before.
And he came to North Dakota for the express purpose of going to Standing Rock, and he outraged the Republican Party and others in North Dakota because he didn't see the governor, he didn't see it. He just went to the reservation.
He's only the third sitting president to ever visit a reservation. Bill Clinton had gone to Pine Ridge, and I've forgotten it. Somebody else had been somewhere, but it was
the flags. You have a story.
Yeah. So I was here. I was at this event. I was about 20 yards from where this photo was taken. Look at the flags in the background. This photo was taken during the powwow in Cannonball, North Dakota, which became the site of the pipeline dispute some years later. And the powwow, the celebration, was on Flag Day, and that's why the flags surrounded
June 14th.
June 14th. So the flags surrounding the Bowery where the powwow dances were taking place. And I had forgotten, and I was reminded at this powwow, that in Native American culture, I mean, many of us, I'm sure, have family or served ourselves. You've been to the funeral of a service member, and they get a flag, triangle, put in the thing, put it up on the mantelpiece, right? Every American home probably has a flag like that. So do natives, and natives serve in the law enforcement or in the armed forces at a much higher percentage than non-natives. In Native American cultures, on powwow days, they take those flags out of those triangles and they fly them at the powwow. Every one of those flags and every one of those 50 flags around the president and those Indian children that day, those native children, was a fallen Lakota or native warrior. And it was very breezy that day. You can see the flags. And the president stood up to talk, and he had a microphone at a stand and a large crowd. And the wind was whipping those flags with such force that the president of the United States had to struggle to be heard over the din of the voices of those native veterans. That is a day I will never forget. And it is a day that I think, when you look at the faces of these children, and you think about these young native leaders, Gen Z, Gen X, these children, the president coming there, honoring them, the symbolism of that, but more important, the work that the Obama administration did in this area, that is the hope, I think, for Indian country going forward. Those young leaders that are going to tell their own stories, and they're going to be the JDs, and they're going to run the salmon conservation programs, and that's the future. That's what gives me hope.
I just want to do one last thing before your questions. I want to play 55, Monty Mills. We interviewed Monty Mills. He's an extraordinary young man, University of Washington, doing a great work. And we had 3 clips, but we only have time now for this one. He's talking about this is not a Republican problem. This is not a Democrat problem. This is something we can actually decide to do together in spite of our partisanship.
I don't think it's as cut and dried as ideological lines, particularly because in many ways, the question of tribal rights and tribal sovereignty isn't uniquely big D Democratic, big R Republican, liberal, conservative, right? I mean, I could see, for example, an argument that a tribe should have responsibility for managing a piece of public land that's next to their reservation. Like, that's local control. I mean, that's core to like the Republican sort of platform. And I could see folks kind of getting behind that. And in the same way, you know, you might see folks from the other side of the aisle be supportive of that for the different values that a tribal manager might bring to the management of that particular landscape. And, you know, you've seen, I think, those cross-cutting issues. It isn't just a liberal, conservative, Democratic, Republican divide necessarily. And I think, you know, Justice Gorsuch is a perfect example. Like, you can understand, in as much as it's, for some of us, particularly challenging to recognize that an originalist perspective on the Constitution, as Gorsuch puts forth and across the board, can be used to support foundational notions of tribal sovereignty. It can, right? He did.
Great. Let's do questions.
Thank you. For those of us who are not familiar with the Gorsuch decision in Oklahoma, could you expound a little bit on that? Because that seems to be one of the more major recent Supreme Court decisions.
Yeah, the decision that Justice Gorsuch authored in Burt, I'm not going to get. I mean, it's a criminal case that goes up, right? There's been a criminal case that has led to a conviction of a native in state court. I have that right. Native in state court who's been convicted of some horrible crime, homicide, double homicide, and this native is going to spend the rest of his life in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He's been convicted by the state, and his lawyer and he take this to the Supreme Court and say, well, you know, the state of Oklahoma doesn't have jurisdiction over me. I'm in Native American. I'm an Indian. I'm an enrolled member of one of the tribes in North Dakota, or excuse me, in Oklahoma, and I committed a crime on my reservation, and only the U.S. Attorney's Office, the federal government, can prosecute me. The key dispute was this still a reservation? Was the Muskogee Creek Reservation still a reservation? And the Supreme Court said, they looked at all the history and said, oh my God, yes, it is still a reservation. The formal legal steps necessary to disestablish those reservations had sort of been glossed over by the state of Oklahoma. Well, I shouldn't say that. They'd probably been more subverted by the state of North Dakota, state of Oklahoma over the last 100 years. And the Supreme Court had the courage to say, you know, the Muskogee Creek Reservation is still a reservation. It's still federal criminal jurisdiction for natives there. And in the ruling, it's the same treaty. It affected all the other tribes in eastern Oklahoma, the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the others. And so we're now left with a lot of lingering litigation and disputes over how that land is going to be controlled. Rob, what your thoughts? Yeah.
And Oklahoma pressing Congress to overturn the McGirt decision. And that's happened before. When tribes won a major decision on gaming, Cabazon case in California, the Supreme Court says, you know what? The state has no right to regulate you. You go and do whatever you want. Congress, the very next year, passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, essentially requiring tribes to negotiate compacts with states. So even when tribes win major victories, even in this case, last term, court cut back on McGirt in another case called Castro Herrera. And what I think they've recognized is, boy, we created a real mess, and maybe we want to step back. And that's the problem. Oftentimes, enforcing tribal treaty rights does create a mess because you've had 100, 150 years of injustice, of ignoring the treaty, and now Indians are saying, make it right. And unfortunately, that can be very inconvenient.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that the mess here was made not by the Supreme Court, but by the people who ignored the treaties and you know, that sort of thing. I know you agree with that, but it is somewhat. I mean, if you'd asked me, and I was part of a group of former U.S. attorneys who filed amicus brief in these cases at the Supreme Court, and you know, I think most people were surprised that the court had the courage to follow law and do what was right.
But we got to go to the next question, but it goes back to Marshall. Domestic dependent sovereigns, that sovereignty matters. It's not full sovereignty, but it is considerable sovereignty.
But recognize that the Supreme Court can overturn that decision tomorrow.
If they want to, yes.
Clay, will you tell us again, the other night you mentioned how many indigenous people were here prior to Columbus, the rough
That is a rough question. Yeah. People disagree considerably, but roughly the new orthodoxy is maybe 35 million down to 237,000 in the year 1900.
And today the number might be what?
Sorry?
What would the number be today, roughly?
6 million, roughly, 2% of the American population.
And it just makes me wonder why the genocidal ceiling isn't leveraged over everything about the land. You know, when we talk about the land was theirs, but we don't really use genocide as a pressure point to ensure that every oppressed person of indigenous culture has the right to housing, water, money. You know, I have a dear friend who's half Southern Ute and half Navajo. And the Southern Ute are some of the wealthiest people, tribal people out there. He has 6 children who are designated Navajo. He had brain surgery at Mayo, everything's covered, has no debt, gets tribal money every month. His children have dental debt, every kind of debt you can imagine, no health care, just pathetic. And they didn't even know their father had these benefits for many years.
So,
Thanks.
And the family is afraid the elders are afraid to work hard for these 6 children to change their designation because typically it goes to the mother's side.
You have to remember that there are 575 tribes, and we've talked about them much today, as is often the shorthand, as Indians, a monolith. You know, that it's one big, that all the tribes are the same and you can interact with them all the same. It's 575 different stories, different treaties, different histories, different models of government, different types of government, different constitutions, different self-determined methods of determining who is a member of the tribe and who isn't a member of the tribe. And it can be very difficult, very complicated, and it's just important to remember that just because, you know, one tribe, there are tribes that are successful in gaming. There are a lot of tribes that are not, that do not have those dollars. There are tribes that have other industries, and there are tribes that struggle. It is not a monolith, and tribes are all different and different histories, and you have to remember all that as you think about it. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but it is not a monolith.
It's incredibly complex.
Very complicated.
Next question, please.
Hi, I read a book fairly recently by Vine Deloria Jr. It was kind of a philosophy book, which is pretty rare among American Indians. Anyway, he quoted a Yale legal scholar regarding the water rights issue of the Colorado River, and he said how this particular Yale scholar said that we should reinstitute the understanding of the native peoples about ownership of land and water rights, which was communal rather than individual. And I was just wondering if there's, from the legal point of view, any recognition of that in American law now.
And Rob, Vine Deloria Jr. was your mentor.
Yeah, Vine recruited me to the University of Arizona. We had this wonderful presentation on Edward Curtis, and all the Indians are very stoic looking, right? And if you know Indian people, they have a great sense of humor. So after he recruits me to the U of A, I say, Vine, what do I need to know about, moving to Tucson, the U of A? He says, well, wait a minute, Williams. Let me tell you, don't move to the west part of town. I go, what do you mean? He says, yeah, you drive to work in the morning, the damn sun's in your eyes. You come home at night, the damn sun's. This was my guru. This was my mentor, but it was good advice. We live up in the north now. And I remember that. I'm pretty sure he was referring to Felix Kohn, who invented this wonderful metaphor right after World War II. Kohn was a very famous Jewish philosopher. His father had been a very prominent philosopher. And he said, we should look at the Indian like the miner's canary, very much like the Jew, served the same role in Hitler. If you know the story of the miner's canary, as the canary stops singing, the miner knows there's poison gas there. And he says, the way we treat the Indian tells us the health of our own democracy. Now, understand that when the miners left, they didn't take the canary with them, right? And Kohn came from this wonderful generation of Indian reformers. John Collier, who lived with the Hopi and Zuni and did peyote with them. Felix Kohn, who had spent time with Indian tribes. And really, these were the first federal bureaucrats who really understood. In fact, Felix Kohn's wife was an anthropologist and spent time on the reservation. And they really began to understand the complexity of the Indian worldview. These weren't savages. These weren't people who had no laws, no government. They had a very sophisticated cosmology. And Kohn brought that understanding to his own work and wrote the most important book ever in federal Indian law called the Handbook of Federal Indian Law. And Felix Frankfurter called it basically the best thing that's ever been done, because he pulled together all these contradictory statutes, all these contradictory cases, and came up with a basic principle. He said the fundamental principle of all Indian law is that tribes have inherent retained sovereignty, and until Congress takes that away, it should remain. And Indian tribes, that's why we want to get more of it back. We want to work on that sort of idea that Kohn put out there, that tribes have the right to continue to exist as tribal peoples, and don't expect them to just sit back and accept the present situation. Right. They are a dynamic, these tribes today are dynamic, they have great leaders, the young people. They're going to be knocking on your door, and they're going to want a seat at the table.
So the book probably is God is Read.
Yes.
But he also wrote Custer Died for Your Sins, and those are books worth reading. Vine Deloria was one of the supreme intellectuals of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Yeah. And his son, Philip Deloria, is now a star at Harvard and has written some really amazing books, one of which is called Indians in Unexpected Places, and more recently a book called Playing Indian, about pageantry and the way white people have played Indians in different ways.
Yeah, the great story about Vine, he got his first book contract by publishing an essay in Playboy magazine in 1969, back when Playboy, you really did read it for the articles, right? And what had happened was Hugh Hefner had published this story on Malcolm X. He had gotten Arthur Haley, who wrote Roots, to do an interview, because Malcolm wouldn't do an interview with no white journalist. And he sold more copies of Playboy without Malcolm X interview than he'd ever sold before. So he said, let's interview Cesar Chavez, let's find an Indian. Found Vine Deloria, who wrote that wonderful essay. It's a wonderful essay called Custer Died for Your Sins. And it became the basis of his book.
Yeah. Rob, only if you can do this concisely.
That train left
you
the
mentioned
station.
Mike, listen, I'm named after a Lumbee tobacco auctioneer, all right?
just because this won't be the last question and we're running out of time, but you mentioned critical race theory several times. Can you give us a concise
description of critical race theory because it is bandied about, it is being used as a weapon, and most people don't understand it.
It's to put the story of blacks, of Asians, of LGBTQ folks, of Indian people at the center, to tell the story of what we've been trying to do today from an Indian perspective. You don't have to be African American to do critical race theory. Some of our best scholars on the issue of whiteness, there's books on whiteness. And so critical race theory tries to recenter the story. And as my colleague Mari Matsuda said, tell the story from the bottom up. And that could be very disturbing. You hear things that you didn't learn about in grade school. And so that's what it's really about. It's drawing on a lot of different critical literature. A lot of it happens to be grounded in Western Marxism, so you have that thrown at CRT. But it's really just a big toolbox where you're trying to deconstruct where did the Doctrine of Discovery come from? Before I spent 5 years writing a book, no Indian scholar had ever looked into the history of the Doctrine of Discovery. And so it's that ability to look at fugitive slave laws, to look at racially restrictive covenants from that perspective.
Thank you for that, and that was very concise.
Next question's here, and before we take it, gentlemen, I will ask you after the program for reading recommendations, and I will send that out as a follow-up email to the group.
And films too, James, films.
Films, along with the program that Clay did in June with us as good historical background. So fear not, you don't have to take rigorous notes as these recommendations come off the stage.
We've got 12 minutes here.
Last year, on the recommendation of our distinguished moderator, I read Lakota American.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent book.
Excellent book.
As I read it, the whole time I was reading the book, it just came into my mind. I kept thinking, around the 1860s, it seemed like the Native leaders realized that, this tsunami was coming. There really wasn't any way they were going to stop it with traditional means. And I kept thinking, if only they had looked a little differently and taken some of their best youth, sent them to London, sent them back east to become lawyers. And it's a what-if question, I realize that. But would it have made I just can't help think it would have made a much greater difference at the time had they put together a cadre of lawyers to begin working against that rather than what they did. And I guess follow-up that is, well, is it too late? Better late than never. It sounds like they're trying to take that track now.
It's interesting. Native American students who were enrolled members of tribes couldn't even go to the University of Arizona in 1958 because Arizona state government said you are wards of the federal government and you are not entitled, and you don't pay taxes, so you're not entitled to go to law school, undergraduate. And that was true. My tribe's from the South. I understood sort of, that sort of black-white dichotomy. When you get to the West, you folks didn't have a lot of black people to kick around, okay? And so the group that you picked on was the group that had a lot of resources that you wanted. It was Indians. And that New Mexico also, I'm sure Colorado had restrictions on native voting, native education. The only alternative was these reservation schools where they literally taught the women how to hang curtains because Indians didn't have curtains on their hogans and you could walk by and you were just polite, you didn't look. And taught them how, you have these manuals on how to teach Indian women to set silver on the table. And then men were taught agricultural pursuits, and that was the education that was suitable for Indians.
I would just say this, it's tangentially related to what you're talking about, but I was just involved in a case I tried in June in Fargo. It's an anti-gerrymandering case that the state legislature in North Dakota has gerrymandered and reduced the number of natives serving in the state legislature, and as a result of this, I learned a whole bunch of things. And we natives don't vote at the same rates as other races, and so why is that? Why are they less frequent voters? Well, the social science tells us that the number one predictor of whether or not you're going to be a regular voter, you're going to vote regularly, is whether or not your parents voted regularly. And you have to remember that in North Dakota, Native Americans didn't get the right to vote until
1924, Snyder Act at least.
Well, after that, though, within the state. I mean, it came later. And so when your grandparents, again, this is all not that long ago, when your grandparents couldn't vote, it's not surprising that your parents didn't vote much, and then that leads to you not voting that much. So there is this idea that that the system that was that the tribes, the natives found themselves in, even in the mid 20th century, was not set up to move them forward. They were still suffering from the existence of these sorts of policies and higher education and voting and things like that.
Yeah, William Rehnquist got his start in the Republican Party by challenging Indian and Mexican voters in line at Phoenix polling stations.
Let's do a couple more here.
Yes, this question has to do with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I'm wondering, I understand that it was adjacent to the reservation, but that pipeline's pretty long, lots of miles. And I'm just wondering why it was that it was focused so much on the Indian tribes making protests instead of all the other people that were adjacent to that pipeline.
Yeah, there were anti-DAPL efforts in other parts of the country. I'm thinking of Iowa, things like
Nebraska.
that. Things that were Nebraska, things that were centered on the use. The people who were adverse to the use of eminent domain to take the pipeline land. Those sorts of things. To me, again, I don't speak for the tribe. I don't do any of that. But for me, when the decision was made as part of the pipeline permitting process to move the DAPL pipeline from north upriver of Bismarck, where I live, to south of Bismarck, but still upriver of the reservation, a mile north of the reservation, that I would describe that decision as one that brings in the concept of environmental justice. And why is it that communities of color in various places, why is it that in where I went to law school in St. Paul, why was the interstate built through the Rondo neighborhood, which was the historic, vibrant black neighborhood in St. Paul that doesn't exist anymore? And so why did DAPL, the protest by the tribe, start up? The Standing Rock Sioux said, we haven't been consulted, this endangers our water, you've moved this, you've taken it, you've protected the city of Bismarck. If this pipeline is so safe, why don't we share the safety with the people of Bismarck, right? And that, when that word went out across Indian country, it resonated with other tribes. And you had this historic gathering of tribes, and then you attracted environmentalists, environmental protesters, and at that point, things changed in a way. But that's kind of the history, I think, of how it developed. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I tried to.
But just a couple of quick things about that. One is that, so water matters to natives in a way that it's hard sometimes for non-natives to understand, although we're starting to understand the scarcity of water. But, water is life is almost a universal motto in Indian country, and this pipeline was going to be just 1 mile north of the reservation boundary. If you don't see the cynicism of that, then you don't see cynicism. And now the irony is that Bismarck is protesting a pipeline just north of Bismarck, and the white people of Bismarck we're not having that pipeline here.
Yeah, let me trust me, let me tell this story quick.
Uh-huh.
When I represented the chairman who had been sued by the pipeline and got TRO that he couldn't protest anymore, I haven't told this story very many times. I was approached by a representative of the pipeline company, and he said, well, I can talk to you, you represent the chairman, and we want to settle this. What's the dollar figure? What's the money? And Standing Rock, they got a lot of needs. How much money is it going to take to get the tribe on board with this?
We can do a lot of good for the tribe.
Do a lot of good for the tribe. You know what story I immediately told the guy? The story of the Black Hills and the $1 billion sitting in the bank account in Washington. I said,
Accruing interest.
Tribes don't want the $1 billion. They want the Black Hills. Standing Rock doesn't want your money. They don't want the pipeline endangering their water supply.
They want to be at the table, too.
They want to be at the table, too. And that part of the respect for the land, right? The land being part of the culture, the important to this society, is something that as a non-native, as a Westerner, raised in Western education, classical education, I think $1 billion is a lot of money, right? I mean, I think,
You'd sell.
Right. No. But I mean, it's hard. It's hard. You have to step back and think about things from a variety of, put yourself in the shoes of that chairman, that chairperson who wants to make sure his or her tribe exists in 50 years or 100 years.
Let's do this one, and then I want to ask a closing quick question, but go ahead.
I'm thinking about the challenges of educating these Native American children. I went to the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, and at that time they had a huge school there, which was then called the Haskell Indian Institute, which I think maybe now is called the university. But are these, and I'm assuming that there are benefits for Native American children to go there. Is that true? And are there other colleges or schools around the country that also can help in this education?
I can tell a quick story about that. There's a Wahpeton Indian School in eastern North Dakota. It's where Louise Erdrich, the most gifted of all North Dakota writers, studied as a child. It's now changed its mission so completely that it's apologetic in almost every way for its past, and it's trying to do the right thing now by empowering young Native people. Sometimes it's good for them to be amongst their own people, to study under comfortable conditions, and so there's a slight survival and resurgence of some of this.
Yeah, I've recruited students from the Haskell University for the law school. That was an institution 50 years ago, didn't do really well for Indian people. It sort of had this termination, assimilation model. Since it's come under leadership of Indian presidents, Indian border regions, it's totally shifted its focus. It now focuses on nation building, American Indian literature. It is a force of good, and plays a very important role in educating a generation of Indian leaders. The kids who go there tend to come from leadership families because they understand how important that is, and they come back. And I think one of the things that's really important, I get this a lot, the NAVO chairman says, I send my Indian kids down there to Tucson and they've read House Made of Dawn by Scott Momaday 6 times, but they can't balance a budget. And so you're seeing many American Indian Studies programs. You're seeing a number of universities now focusing on indigenous governance. Gonzaga has a great program on indigenous governance and economic development. And you're seeing more universities. Arizona recognizes if you're going to have a future, your future lies with that large cohort of young Native students who are between 12 and 16. You better get them ready, and you better have programs that are culturally relevant for them. So you've seen a revolution in American higher education, particularly in the West, as to how American Indians can fit into this larger university and college picture.
And these schools are voluntary.
That's right.
No one is taken off the reservation and taken to one of these schools. So I know you might have some more questions. We'll linger, of course. I want to thank everyone. I want to ask you one final question, but first, thank you to Robert Williams of the University of Arizona. Your wife Joy is with us, and we're glad to have her too. Joy, raise your hand.
She's heard all my jokes before, but she still listens.
Yeah, she had the worst time of anybody here tonight.
And to my Gen X friend here, really? Yeah. Tim Purdon of North Dakota, thank you. I'm going to be telling that story in the pubs of Bismarck.
Well, that's fine. I mean, the boomers, they all want everybody to be a boomer, right? They got all, right.
I asked AI chat who was better, the Rolling Stones or Beatles. They said Rolling Stones.
Yeah, right.
So last question, and of course we have to be absolutely brief on this, but it's an essential question. And that is the myth of inevitability. And you know this, both of you, that the standard narrative is too bad, but it was inevitable. That what happened to Native Americans, the displacement, the cultural genocide, etc., it was essentially inevitable the moment that Europeans with their land ideas and their property concepts and their industrialization came to these shores. And however much we lament this, it was essentially inevitable. Take that on.
Yeah, and I've studied this to a man. Every single one of the founders believed there wouldn't be any more Indians in 2 generations. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. Our job was to assimilate them, turn them into yeoman farmers. And Indians resisted. Despite 200 years of genocidal and ethnocidal policies, they are still here. And so I think that's the important lesson. They're not going away, and they demand that seat at the table. They demand free, prior, and informed consent on impacts that affect their lives. They have demand to be consulted, and they demand to control their own destinies, the exact same things all of you want.
We stumbled over this, but let me make this point. In what you said, this statistic the other night, in 1900 there were
237,000 Native Americans.
237,000 Native Americans. started out with many millions. Can you imagine how tough you have to be to come back from 1900, when there were 237
To 6 million today.
to 6 million, and your tribes were on the ropes, and your land was going away, and there was smallpox? Do you imagine how hard you would have to work, and how much you'd have to care about your family and your clan and your tribe? And you are now a native lawyer coming out of, and these folks I worked with in the Obama administration that are coming back to their tribes and doing this, and they've left, they've served the government, served public servants, now going back to serve their tribe, be the chairman, be the general, be the attorney general, those sorts of things. The commitment you have to, you know how easy it is to get off the treadmill, not move back to Bay Mills, wherever. I mean, I have a friend who was chairman at the Bay Mills, and you know, it's hard to be a tribal chairperson. Listen, I'm a 55-year-old white guy raised in kind of a, you know, middle-class family. I don't know anybody that tough. I don't know anybody that committed to their family. I don't know anybody that committed to the people that are important to them. And when I see that and I think of inevitability, yeah, you know what? It was inevitable. It was inevitable that the tribes were going to rise and gain this power back and become, again, in the West particularly, some of the hope for rural America writ large, not just for themselves. So that's how I look at it.
And one last thing about inevitability. Sand Creek did not have to happen. No. Wounded Knee did not have to happen. The Dawes Act did not have to happen. These were policy choices made by a people that regarded themselves as self-governing. Each of those things could have gone another way. So when we say inevitability, I think that's a sloppy way of trying to look at something, in a sense, to cheer ourselves up for all that has happened. I want to say one last thing. First of all, thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you so much. But I do want to say that that the honest people can disagree with a good portion of what they've heard here tonight, and people of goodwill can have very different views of all of this. And there's no attempt here to demonize anybody's point of view. We are all struggling to make sense of the enormous complexity of American history, and it would be a mistake if we gave the impression that all Orthodox or enlightened people agree, because there's plenty of room in between the discussions that we've had in every direction, and it's important that we regard that with respect. And it's hard sometimes, but I want all of you to know, especially if you feel a little edgy about some of what you've heard tonight, to realize that this is a set of point of views by amazing experts, but they don't have the only way of seeing these questions.
Yeah. I want to be crystal clear. Nobody in Bismarck, North Dakota agrees with me about anything.
including your age, honey. James.
Before we thank them a final time, I will ask for a show of hands. At the outset, I stated the mission of these programs as to deepen understanding. We think about it as, can we encourage more civil discourse around the dinner table or the Thanksgiving table? So if we accomplish that mission in this conversation tonight, would you please put your hand in the air? Let us know that you're leaving this room smarter and more compassionate than you came in. That means so much to us, and that is the validation for the effort of coming and preparing. Thank you. Please thank Rob Williams Jr., Tim Purdon, and Clay Jenkinson.
Hey, great job. This was a lot of fun.
It was. This was great.